She sat on the floor of her apartment. The rejection letter was still open on her laptop. 3 years of work, hundreds of hours, and now 4 sentences telling her it wasn't enough. Her hands were shaking, not with anger, with something quieter, something that felt in that moment very much like the end. Maybe you know that feeling. Maybe you have had your own flaw moment, the moment when something you believed in, a dream, a relationship, a version of yourself, simply collapsed, and the world kept moving, indifferent, while you sat very still inside the wreckage. What happens next is what this story is about, because here is what we know. Some people never quite recover from moments like that. They carry the failure like a wound that never fully closes. But others, and this is the extraordinary part, others come out of those moments somehow more aware, more resilient, more deeply and strangely themselves. How? Why? What is the hidden difference between the person who is broken by failure and the person who is built by it? That is the question at the heart of everything you are about to hear. Chapter 1. The moment everything falls apart. Let's talk about what failure actually feels like. Not the cleaned-up version where someone says, "I failed and then I learned so much," but the raw, unfiltered experience. The confusion, the shame, the quiet but devastating question that rises up in the middle of the night. Was I wrong about myself? When we fail at something that truly matters to us, it isn't just an event, it is an identity crisis. Because so much of what we believe about ourselves is tied to what we do and what we achieve. When that disappears, so does a piece of who we thought we were. Consider a man named Daniel. He had spent 15 years building his business. He was proud of it, not just for the money, but because it was his idea, his creation, something he had shaped from nothing with his own hands, his own risk, his own sleepless nights of belief. And then, slowly at first, and then all at once, it failed. The contracts dried up, the employees left, the doors closed. Daniel lost the business, but what followed him afterward was something harder to name, something more personal than a financial loss. He told me, and here I am sharing a story that reflects the experience of many real people. He told me that the worst part wasn't the money, it was the silence afterward. The way his phone stopped ringing, the way he would introduce himself at a party and suddenly not know what to say after his own name. Who was he without the thing he had built? That question followed him everywhere, into coffee shops, into conversations with old friends, into the long and sleepless middle of the night. Failure, at its most intense, is a question about identity, and questions about identity are among the most frightening things a human being can face. But here is something important. That discomfort, that unmooring, groundless feeling, is not only pain, it is also potential. When the old story about who you are breaks down, there is, for a brief and terrifying moment, space. Space to ask the deeper question, who do I actually want to become? Not many people recognize that space, not immediately. In the beginning, most of us just feel the loss, and that is entirely okay. Grief is not weakness, it is the honest response to something real being gone. The question is not whether you feel it, the question is what you do with it over time. Chapter 2. The Two Paths After Failure. Researchers who study resilience, the ability to recover and adapt after difficult experiences, have noticed something remarkably consistent. After a significant failure, people tend to move in one of two broad directions. The paths don't split immediately. At first they feel the same. Both are painful, both are confusing, both are deeply unwelcome. But over time they diverge. One path leads inward and downward. The person begins to see the failure as evidence that they are not smart enough, not talented enough, not lucky enough, not worthy enough of success. The failure becomes a verdict, a permanent judgment on who they fundamentally are. The other path also leads inward, but it leads somewhere profoundly different. The person begins to see the failure as information, not a verdict about who they are, but a message about what they did, what they believed, what they tried, and what might need to change. The failure becomes a teacher. The psychologist Carol Dweck spent decades studying these two orientations. She called them the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. In a fixed mindset, your abilities are seen as permanent and unchangeable. You either have talent or you do not, so failure becomes terrifying. It appears to reveal a permanent limit about who you are. In a growth mindset, abilities are seen as something that can develop. Effort matters, strategy matters, learning matters. So failure, painful as it genuinely is, becomes part of a process, not a stop sign telling you to turn back, more like a detour, a harder, longer road that still leads somewhere real. Now, it would be easy to say, just choose a growth mindset, but that is not quite honest, because our mindset is not always a calm and deliberate choice. It is often a habit, shaped quietly over years by our upbringing, our culture, and the words of teachers and parents and coaches we heard when we were very young. Some of us were told, "You are so smart," every time we succeeded as children. It sounds like a compliment, and it is meant warmly, but it quietly creates a trap, because if your success is about being smart, then your failure must be about not being smart. And so the stakes of every single attempt become very, very high. Others were told, "You worked so hard on that," or "You found a new way to try." These phrases, seemingly small, planted a different kind of seed. They told the child what matters is the effort, the attempt, the willingness to engage with something difficult, not only the result at the end. And so, long before any adult failure arrives, the groundwork is being laid. The question is not only what happened to you when you fell. The deeper question is, what story about effort and identity and worthiness was already being built inside you long before the hard moments came? Chapter 3. The Science of Growing Through Pain. In the 1990s, two American psychologists, Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, began studying something that genuinely surprised them. They were working with people who had survived terrible losses, serious illness, the death of loved ones, life-altering accidents, and they expected to document damage, trauma, long-term suffering. What they found was more complicated. The damage was real, the suffering undeniable. But alongside the pain, many of the people they studied reported something completely unexpected. A deepened sense of gratitude for ordinary life, stronger and more honest relationships, and a new clarity about what actually matters. And perhaps most surprising of all, a feeling of personal strength they had not known they possessed before the hard thing happened. A sense that they had looked at something terrible and found that they were still standing. Tedeschi and Calhoun named this phenomenon post-traumatic growth. Their research opened a new kind of conversation, not about how to avoid suffering, which is impossible, but about the conditions under which suffering could lead to genuine, lasting transformation. The key word is conditions. Post-traumatic growth is not automatic. Not everyone who suffers grows from the experience. What makes the difference? The research points to several factors, and they are things that can, to a meaningful degree, be understood and even practiced. The first factor is what researchers call cognitive processing, the way we actively think through and make sense of what happened. This is the ability to turn the experience over in your mind, examine it carefully, question your assumptions about it, and begin to construct meaning from it. Not to explain it away, not to pretend it didn't hurt, but to ask honestly, what does this mean? What can I understand now that I couldn't understand before? This is harder than it sounds. Pain, especially acute, raw pain, makes clear thinking difficult. Under serious stress, our brains tend to be reactive rather than reflective, reaching for distraction or numbness. Real processing requires us to stay with the discomfort a little longer, to be curious about it rather than simply desperate to escape it. The second factor is social connection. People who grow after serious difficulty almost universally report that they did not do it alone. They had someone, a trusted friend, a family member, a mentor, a therapist, who was willing to sit with them in the dark. Not to fix the problem, not to offer easy answers, simply to be present and to bear witness. This matters because isolation feeds the worst stories we tell about ourselves. In silence, the inner critic grows louder and more convincing. In connection, there is the possibility of perspective. Someone who truly sees you, not just the failure, but you as a person, can remind you who you actually are beneath the difficulty. The third factor may surprise you. It is a degree of challenge to existing beliefs. Growth, research has found, often happens when people are genuinely forced to question what they thought was true about the world, about themselves, about how life is supposed to work. Comfortable beliefs, left completely undisturbed, do not tend to produce growth. It is the disruption that opens the door. Think of it this way. Imagine a tree that grows only in ideal conditions, plenty of sunlight, plenty of water, rich, soft soil. That tree may grow quickly and look impressive, but it also becomes brittle. Its roots are shallow because they never had to reach deep for sustenance. The easy conditions made depth unnecessary. Now imagine a tree that grows in difficult terrain, strong winds, periods of drought, rocky, resistant earth. That tree grows more slowly. Its shape may be less perfect, but its roots go deep, spreading far beneath the surface in search of what it needs. And when the great storms come, it holds. It holds because it had to learn to hold. Chapter 4. Stories of People Who Rose. Throughout history, and across every culture and every century, there have been people whose stories of failure have become inseparable from their eventual greatness. not because the failure was secretly a good thing in the moment it happened. It wasn't. Not because they enjoyed it or welcomed it. They didn't. But because something in the way they responded to it changed everything that came after. Consider the story of a young woman named Maya. She grew up in a small town, quietly carrying a dream of becoming a writer. From the time she was very young, she filled notebooks with stories, characters who felt real to her, worlds she could disappear into when the real one felt too ordinary or too hard. She finished her first novel at the age of 28. It had taken her 3 years of evenings and weekends, of writing while the rest of the world slept. She sent it to publishers, and then she waited. The response came back, no. She sent it again, no. And again. For 2 full years and 32 rejections, the answer was consistently not this. She described her process later in an interview. After each rejection, she said, she allowed herself to cry once, a full, honest, nothing-held-back cry, and then she opened the manuscript and looked for what needed to be better. Cry, then revise. That was the rhythm she built for herself, and she kept it without apology. That rhythm, cry then revise, is more significant than it might initially appear. She allowed herself the grief. She did not pretend the rejection didn't hurt, or that it didn't matter, or that she was somehow above the pain of being told no. But she also did not let the grief be the end of the story. She used the pain as fuel for the next draft. The 33rd submission was accepted. Her book was published. It changed readers' lives. Then there is Thomas, an engineer who spent 3 years developing a product he believed, with genuine conviction, would transform his industry. He invested his savings. He convinced people he loved and respected to invest theirs. He built a small team. He built a vision. And then the product failed, spectacularly, publicly, expensively. There was no quiet way out. He lost money. He lost certain friendships that couldn't survive the financial strain. He lost sleep and health, and for a time the ability to imagine a future that didn't carry the weight of what had gone wrong. But he also, in those difficult months of facing what had happened, lost something that had needed to go. He lost his arrogance, his certainty, his assumption that intelligence and hard work alone were sufficient without humility and genuine collaboration, without the willingness to truly listen to the people around him. Failure had taught him what success never could have, because success had never required him to question himself this deeply. The second company he built was different, not because he was now a more talented engineer. He had always been skilled, but because he listened. He asked questions instead of delivering answers. He created space for the people around him to tell him when he was wrong. He had learned through the most painful teacher available that no one succeeds entirely alone. These are illustrative stories, but the patterns they reflect are real and well documented in research and biography alike. People who speak most honestly and thoughtfully about their failures tend to share certain qualities. They do not minimize what happened. They do not pretend it was secretly easy or ultimately fine. But they also, eventually, stop treating the failure as a permanent condition and start treating it as an experience, one chapter in a much longer story. History offers us a name almost synonymous with this kind of perseverance. J.K. Rowling submitted the manuscript for Harry Potter and was rejected by 12 publishers before a small London house finally said yes. She was a single mother, living on benefits, and had endured profound personal loss. Today, she is one of the most read authors in human history. A story turned away 12 times, now translated into over 80 languages and read by hundreds of millions. There is a Japanese philosophy called wabi-sabi. It is the art of finding beauty in imperfection, in old, worn, irregular things, in the texture of something that has been used and marked by time. And there is a related Japanese practice called kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. When a ceramic bowl breaks, the kintsugi artist does not discard it, and they do not try to hide the damage with an invisible repair. Instead, they fill each crack with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The cracks become visible. They are highlighted, made luminous, because the breaking and the careful repair that followed are precisely what make the object most beautiful. What if we thought about ourselves that way? What if the places where we broke and then slowly, painfully, carefully came back together? What if those were not our flaws to be ashamed of, but our most interesting features? Not the proof of our weakness, but the visible evidence of our survival. Chapter 5. The Beliefs That Make the Difference. We have talked about mindset, about the science of post-traumatic growth, about the stories of people who rose from genuinely difficult places. But there is something deeper beneath all of these things, something more personal and often more hidden. It is the set of beliefs, frequently invisible, frequently unexamined, that govern how we interpret what happens to us. Psychologists call this our explanatory style, the automatic way we explain events to ourselves, the internal story we tell about why things happened, often before we are even consciously aware we are doing it. And there are two especially important dimensions to this style that shape our response to failure more than almost anything else. The first dimension is whether we see bad events as permanent or as temporary. This will always be this way. This is simply who I am. Versus, this is how things are right now. This is where I am at this particular moment in time. Those two sentences look similar, but they lead to entirely different futures. The second dimension is whether we see bad events as all-encompassing or as specific. I fail at everything. I am fundamentally a person who cannot succeed. Versus, I failed at this particular thing, in this particular context, at this particular time. The difference in those phrases may sound small on the surface, but the difference in their psychological weight is enormous. The psychologist Martin Seligman, who spent much of his career studying what he called learned helplessness, found something striking. People who explained their failures in permanent and all-encompassing ways were significantly more likely to give up, to fall into depression, and to fail again in the future. Not because they were less intelligent or less capable, but because their internal story made continued effort feel utterly pointless. On the other side, people who explained failures as temporary and specific, even when the failures themselves were objectively identical, showed dramatically more persistence in the face of difficulty, more creativity in finding alternative solutions, more genuine willingness to try again, not because they were unrealistic or naive, but because their inner story gave them room to move forward. It's important to say clearly, having a hopeful, explanatory style does not mean denying reality. It does not mean pretending that hard things don't hurt or that failure has no real consequences. The goal is not blind, unconditional optimism. The goal is what Seligman called flexible optimism, the ability to see things with honest clarity and also to choose the interpretation that serves your future rather than simply feeding your fear. There is another belief that makes a profound difference. It is the belief about the relationship between effort and identity. Some people believe that needing to work very hard at something is evidence that they lack natural talent, that if you were truly gifted, it would come easily. This belief is deeply embedded in many cultures, and it is, in a single word, dangerous, because effort is not a sign of inadequacy. Effort is the mechanism by which ability actually grows. The brain changes structurally, physically, measurably in response to sustained practice and genuine challenge. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. Every time you struggle with something difficult, new neural pathways form and strengthen. You are not merely practicing a skill, you are reshaping the physical architecture of your mind. So, when failure feels hard, when the learning feels slow and frustrating and uncomfortably humbling, that is not a signal that you don't belong. That is not evidence that you should stop. That is the sensation of your brain doing its most important work. That feeling of difficulty is not the obstacle. That feeling of difficulty is the process itself. Chapter 6. The Hidden Gift Inside Failure. Let me say something that might sound strange. Failure can be a gift, not in the sense that it feels good. It genuinely does not. Not in the sense that you should seek it out or welcome it with open arms, but in the sense that it can give you things that nothing else in life is capable of giving you. The first gift is clarity. When everything is going well and the path ahead seems smooth, it is surprisingly easy to stay on a road that isn't really yours, to pursue goals that look impressive from the outside but don't actually align with who you genuinely are or what you genuinely care about. Success, especially when it comes early or easily, can trap you in a life that fits perfectly on paper but feels hollow inside. Failure strips that comfortable illusion away. It forces the raw and unavoidable question, why was I doing this in the first place? And sometimes the honest answer is, I don't actually know. Or, more uncomfortably, because someone else expected it of me. Or because I thought it would make people respect me. These are not bad admissions, they are honest ones, and honesty about your own motivations is the beginning of real self-knowledge. The second gift is empathy. People who have genuinely struggled, who have known real failure, real rejection, real loss, often become profoundly more compassionate toward others who are in difficulty. It is easy to be impatient with someone who is falling apart when you yourself have never truly fallen apart. Failure softens that edge. It gives you a memory in your body. It says, I have been there. I know from the inside how this feels. And empathy is not only a moral quality, though it is certainly that, it is also a deeply practical and relational one. The leaders, teachers, parents, and friends who are most trusted and most deeply valued are almost always people who have known some form of difficulty. Their authority comes not from their success alone, but from their scars, from the visible evidence that they have faced something hard and kept going anyway. The third gift is what I will call earned confidence. There is a kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested, from always succeeding, from always being the best person in the room. That confidence is real in its way, but it is also brittle. It is loud. It needs constant external validation to survive. Take away the success, and it crumbles almost immediately. But the confidence that comes from having genuinely failed and recovered, from having sat on the floor in the dark and then slowly and without fanfare stood back up, that confidence is something entirely different. It is quiet. It does not need to perform. It does not require anyone else's approval to exist. It is built not on the belief that you will always succeed. It is built on the knowledge, the earned, tested, deeply felt knowledge that you can survive not succeeding. And that, arguably, is the more powerful belief of the two. Think carefully about what changes when you know, not simply hope, but genuinely know that failure will not destroy you. You become willing to take risks you would never have considered before. You apply for the position that seems too ambitious. You say the honest thing in the meeting, even when it is uncomfortable. You begin the creative project that might not work, because the worst-case scenario, failure, is something you have already survived. It is no longer an abstraction, it is a lived experience, and you are still here, still thinking, still moving, still, in the most important sense, intact. The thing you feared most has already happened, and the world did not end. That knowledge is profoundly freeing. Closing reflection. We began this story with a young woman sitting on the floor of her apartment, a rejection letter still open on her laptop, 3 years of work and 4 sentences telling her it wasn't enough. Let me tell you what happened next. Not because the story has a perfect, triumphant ending, but because what she did in the following days says something true about what we have been exploring together. She stayed on the floor for a while. She let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. She did not rush past it or pretend it was fine. She called a friend, not to be fixed or advised or told that everything would work out, but simply to be heard. She cried, she slept, and when she woke the next morning, she did not feel better. But she did something remarkable in its quietness. She opened a new document, and she started again. Not because she was fearless, she was not. Not because the rejection had stopped hurting, it hadn't. Not because she had found a perfect mindset that made everything suddenly make sense. She started again because somewhere underneath the pain, she still believed that the effort was worth making. That is the thread that runs through every story and every idea in this episode. Not talent, not exceptional luck, not some rare, special kind of person who simply doesn't feel pain the way the rest of us do. The thread is a choice, quiet, unglamorous, sometimes made from the floor, to continue, to try again, to remain inside the story even when the story becomes genuinely hard. You will fail at things. If you are living with any real degree of honesty and ambition, if you are reaching for anything that genuinely matters to you, you will know what it feels like to fall short, to be rejected, to invest yourself fully and not succeed. This is not a flaw in the design of your life. This is the design. The difficulty is the road, not something that happens beside it. The question is never whether failure will find you. It will. In some form, at some time, it always does. The question is what you will allow it to mean, whether you let it write the final sentence of your story, or whether you pick up the pen, trembling a little, uncertain, not yet knowing what comes next, and keep going. Because here is the truth that all of the research, all of the stories, all of the philosophy and science and human experience returns to, again and again. The people who become mentally stronger after failure are not people who suffer less than others. They are not shielded from the pain or built differently from the rest of us. They are people who have learned, sometimes slowly, sometimes through great difficulty, to let the suffering teach them something. Again and again, the research points to the same pattern. Mentally stronger people reflect instead of avoid, connect instead of isolate, learn instead of judge, and begin again instead of giving up. They are people who stayed curious in the dark when it would have been much easier to close down completely, who reached out to another human being instead of disappearing into isolation, who asked honestly and without self-protection, "What does this mean? What is this showing me about myself? What is the next thing I can try?" They are people who did not wait until they felt strong to begin again. They began again in order to become strong. There is a difference there that matters. Waiting for the right feeling before you act means that difficult feelings hold permanent power over you. But acting before the feeling fully arrives, moving while still uncertain, beginning before you are ready, that is how the feeling eventually changes. And if you are listening to this after your own failure, after your own flaw moment, then know this: you are not behind where you should be. You are not broken beyond repair. You are not finished or small or wrong about yourself in the way that the darkest hours might suggest. You are, in the most genuine and meaningful sense, in the middle of something important, something that, given time and honesty and the quiet, persistent willingness to keep going, might just turn out to be the most significant chapter of your life, not despite the difficulty, because of what you did with it, because of who you chose to become inside it. The cracks, remember, are where the gold goes. Thank you for listening to English Through Great Stories. Keep learning, keep trying, and keep going, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard.